Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In this video, I'm going to show you how to secure a REST API using API key and usage plan. I will use AWS API Gateway via AWS console to configure this security for API endpoint. With microservice architecture dominating the integration technology, there are millions of APIs out there. Some APIs are used in private network by internal application and some are offered in public platform. It is essential that these API endpoints are protected so that only authorized consumers can have access to these. In this workshop, I will create a REST API GET endpoint using AWS console. I will secure the API using API key, and then I will validate the API endpoint using Postman. Let's look at the architecture design. We have a connected third party. There is the API gateway. API endpoint is integrated via a Lambda function, and Lambda function is getting the requested data from a DynamoDB table. There are two architecture diagrams here. The first one is representing an unsecured endpoint. This API endpoint is open to anyone who has linked to the endpoint. The second architecture diagram here showing that API gateway is protecting the API endpoint using an API key. It's like putting a lock on your asset. If you don't have the key, you will not be able to use the API to get the data from the DynamoDB table via Lambda function. API key and usage plan is one of the many ways that REST API endpoint can be secured to prevent unauthorized access to the API. Basic authentication using username and password, JWT, OAuth, OAuth2 are few other mechanisms that can be implemented to secure the API endpoint depending on the use case. I will use API key and usage plan to secure the API endpoint in this workshop. There are two prereqs for this workshop. One is to have your DynamoDB table. Another one is the Lambda function. I already have a DynamoDB table with some data in it. If you want to learn about creating DynamoDB table using AWS SAM and AWS CloudFormation, please watch my video on this workshop. Link is in the description. I also have a Lambda function created which will be used to integrate with API endpoint. If you want to learn about creating and testing Lambda function, please watch my video on Lambda workshop. Link is in the description for this as well. For this workshop, I'm going to use AWS console to create API key and usage plan. I will then link the usage plan with the API key. Let's get started. I'll create a REST API GET endpoint using AWS console. I will validate the GET endpoint using Postman. I will then add an API key to secure the API endpoint, and then I will add usage plan and link it with API key. First step is to log into AWS console and search for API Gateway service. Once you have found API Gateway service, let's create a REST API. You will see many options like HTTP, WebSocket, REST API. I'm going to create a REST API. Click on build and provide a name for the API. I'm going to name this API as Get Contact Test API. I'm going to leave the endpoint type as regional. Let's create a resource next. I'm going to name this resource as all contacts. Once resource has been created, I'll create a method. Click on create method. From the drop down, I'm going to select a get method since I want to create a get to retrieve the contacts. I'm going to enable Lambda proxy integration and select my Lambda function. And I'm going to leave the default timeout as 29 seconds. Note that API endpoint is created, however, it is not secure. API key required is shown as false. Next, I need to deploy this API. So let's provide a stage name. It could be any name. I'm going to name it as test, and then I'm going to click on deploy. I have my API endpoint now. Let's test this endpoint to ensure that it is indeed fetching the contact records using the get API endpoint. I'm going to use VS Code Postman extension to test this endpoint. If you do not know how to enable the VS Code Postman extension, I will suggest looking at my another video on this topic. I'm going to leave the link for that also in the description. From the Postman, I'm going to click on new HTTP request. I'm going to provide the API endpoint and click on send. I'm getting the record data back. That means my API endpoint is working as expected. Next, let's make this API endpoint secure so that only authorized client app can have access to this API. Let's click on API key. I'm going to create an API key here. I will name this API subscription key as GB app key. I'm going to leave it as auto generate and click on save. API key has been created. Let's go back to our API and edit the method to update the API key required as true. Remember, this was originally set to false, so I'm going to change it from false to true. So it's just as simple as clicking on the checkbox API key required, leave everything else as it is, and deploy the API to your stage. I'm going to go back to my Postman and let's test the API again. As you can see, I got the forbidden message because it's not an open endpoint anymore. It requires a key. Let's now try again after passing the API key in the header, and it still does not work. Why? The reason is that I also need to link this API key with a usage plan. So let's go back to the API key and I'm going to add a usage plan. I'll create a usage plan. Usage plan is a really neat feature. I'm going to name it GB app usage plan. It's really a neat feature. It allows to control how many requests for this API in a given cycle can be made. As you can see in my plan, I'm gonna say that 500 requests per month are allowed. That's the quota for the calling app. Let's link this usage plan with the API key. Next, I will add the associated stage for the API that I have created. Let's now try again after passing the API key in the header. And as you can see, this time I'm getting the record back. It works. My API is now secure, and only the client and the consumer who have the API key and they pass the API key can now retrieve the data. Everyone else who try to access this API will get the forbidden message. With this workshop, a REST API has been created, an endpoint has been secured using API key and usage plan. Consumer will need to have access to this API key in order to invoke the API. There are other ways to secure API as well, like JWT and OAuth. We will explore these ways in another workshop. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm working on some other interesting content on various AWS topics. These will be posted soon. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.